wearing a leopard print top, and I've got brown hair. It's okay, with some pink bangs. My background is actually blurred. So yeah, that's me.
Thank you.
Oh, sorry. Hiya, I'm Emily. My pronouns are she, her. I am wearing a white shirt. I'm a white cis woman. I've got blonde curly hair. And then behind me is just some books and a clothes rail. And I am a freelance theatre producer and co-founder of theatre company Definitely Fine.
Thank you. So we've got two guests who definitely know what they're talking about, and we're very excited to have them. So thank you for joining us. So for the purpose of the session, we will be referencing the movie Supernova, as I said. The movie is about a gay couple who go on sort of their last adventure together. It is partially filmed in the Lake District, which is pretty cool. That's quite close to us. And it's about one of the guys who gets early onset dementia, and it's about sort of their journey as a couple towards the end. And we basically just wanted to talk about what it's like representing queer people in the media and having these filmed with LGBTQ plus representation, and sort of what makes that good, what makes that bad. Well, you know, and just all the nuances that go with that. So we've got Beth giving us a presentation first of all. I will share my screen. Let me know if you can see it.
Okay.
There we go. Can we see?
Yes, I can see it. Okay, so yeah, thank you. So I'll do a presentation first. It's about queer representation in cinema. And like I said before, my name's Beth Meadows, and I'm the community support worker at Lancashire Lgbt. So next slide, please. Just to quickly explain who Lancashire Lgbt are, for those who don't know, we're a pan-Lancashire charity, and we provide information and support to LGBTQ plus people, and that includes everyone on that spectrum. Our main mission is to ensure that LGBTQ plus people in Lancashire are happier, healthier, and better connected. And my role is with our support service. So that kind of support really ranges anything from emotional support, housing, domestic abuse, safeguarding, immigration, mental health, a really wide range of issues I'll try and help support our service users with. Since coming into the role in January, a couple of things have happened with it. So I'm really proud to have set up Lancashire's first lesbian, bi and trans women and non-binary persons peer support group. And we meet fortnightly on Zoom. We will be having our first in-person meeting very soon though, because the COVID restrictions are lifting. And this has become a really gorgeous space actually, where we just kind of support one another as peers, as women and non-binary people. And hopefully we'll be doing a couple of exciting projects in the months to come, one being an art exhibition in Burnley Library and another being a community collaborative zine. And another project that we've been working on since I started in the role is the LGBTQ plus mental health hour. So this is a monthly event on Zoom at the moment where I host and interview people from the LGBTQ plus community who work in or have experience of mental health. So far that's been really successful, and our next one is going to be in August. So yeah, that's kind of in a nutshell what Lancashire LGBT do and what I do within that charity. So next slide, please. Okay, so now I've got a little bit of a history of queer representation in cinema. As you can see, this is not exhaustive, by the way. There's plenty more examples, but this is kind of the ones that I picked out. There's quite a lot on this slide though, so if I just ask you to go to the next slide and I'll speak through a couple of the films that I've just picked out in the pictures. But if you want these slides later, you can return to it and look at all of those different examples. So we've got, firstly, in 1975, there was the Rocky Horror Picture Show. That could be considered sort of the pinnacle of camp. It's a cult classic film, and it's a musical. So for any musical lovers, obviously, I imagine you may have seen it before. Please do go see it if you haven't seen that before. It's an absolutely amazing film. And then we've got just across the way, Paris is Burning. This was a really iconic film because it was the first time that the ballroom subculture, which was in the 1980s in New York, mainly people of color, trans and gender non-conforming people would dance. It's called a voguing style of dance, and they dance in what were called balls, and hence the term ballroom culture. So Paris is Burning was a documentary film about that, and it really catapulted this subculture into the mainstream for the very first time. So with that, obviously there's positives that came with the visibility, but as we'll continue to go on with later in terms of representation, it can also have a counterproductive effect in terms of the safety of that community. So that's Paris is Burning. And then we've got Boys Don't Cry. This was another groundbreaking bit of cinema from 1999. And Hilary Swank played a trans male in that film. And she actually won an Oscar for that portrayal. So it's a film that was based on a true story about a trans male who was unfortunately tragically murdered for being trans. But it's such a poignant film because it's one of the first times that the trans male experience was represented in cinema. And therefore it had, a huge impact on the community for seeing themselves for the first time. The next film is Portrait of Jason, and this was from the 1960s, I believe, by an experimental filmmaker called Shirley Clarke. And Jason was a Black gay sex worker, and she just did a very long interview style documentary film with him. So that was another example of like queer cinema coming out and really pushing the boundaries and trying to break the mold really and do something different. And then we've got Moonlight from 2017. This was the first all Black film and queer film to win the top prize in the Oscars of Best Picture. And Moonlight is a film about two gay Black men and a really gorgeously shot film. Like the cinematography is stunning and the color palette of it is amazing. So I'd really recommend it. I'd recommend all these films. So these are some great examples of queer cinema. There's another slide, thank you. And there's a couple more examples. I'll just go through these a bit more briefly. I'm sure people have seen some of these. So Call Me By Your Name was really famous. A gay male love story set in Italy, gorgeous location setting. And then we've got Carol, which is a lesbian love story, and it's based on a very famous novel called Carol, and that one stars Cate Blanchett. And then we've got Pride. Pride is a really incredible story about lesbian and gay support the minors, and they're an activist group that existed. They were an LGBTQ plus group, but they decided to reach over the boundaries, I suppose, and start supporting the miners during the miners' strikes. And that film Pride is amazing in terms of telling that historical story. And then we've got Tangerine, and this was also a really groundbreaking bit of cinema. It was one of the first films to feature trans women of color about trans women of color. So it's seen as a really authentic portrayal of their experiences. So next slide, please. So those are just some examples of queer cinema. And now I want to come on to speak about, some of the problems and debates within representation. So there's a lack of representation. When there's a lack of representation of a particular community, it's considered quite alienating because it'll contribute to ideas that queer people are not normal and therefore bad if they're not seen very often. And therefore that's a form of othering, which can be really damaging for the queer community. So often there's been quite bad representation in cinema. It's either very one-dimensional when it comes to queer people, really stereotyping, and it's hyper visible for the wrong reasons. For example, during what was called the Hays Code era of Hollywood, and that was an era where sort of having queer roles was very much prohibited, so you had to make them very coded, if at all. So often the villains of the film were depicted as very queer and camp, and that's a really kind of bad example of representation because it'll infer that obviously queer people are criminals or evil in some way. Another example of the way that queer representation has been bad is through the hypersexualization, and this often happens of queer women and lesbians in particular, this sense of hypersexualization. Another couple of examples would be like negative cinematic tropes. So often when we see queer people on screen, it'll be through the lens of them being very self-hating, or their life is defined by struggle as a queer person. Or another thing is called the tragic queer ending, which usually ends in either the queer person taking their own life or dying. Another thing that we'll come in to discuss later, and I know that Emily will come to discuss this, is about straight cis actors playing queer roles. And this is a big like source of controversy and debate within the cinema discourses. But there's been throughout the years many examples of this going wrong, and that's precisely why. A couple of examples of where straight cis actors have taken on either trans roles or gay roles. For example, Dallas Buyers Club. There was most recently Prom, where James Corden played a gay man. And obviously the film in question, Supernova, does feature two straight actors playing queer roles. So another point would be whether no representation in the mainstream cinema space is better or worse than bad representation. So obviously I've spoken a little bit about bad representation and what that looks like, and I'm sure that we can all maybe think of examples, but some people would argue that that is actually still better than having no representation at all, because if you're hidden, that means that you're forgotten about and almost having like no rights or no visibility. But this is something that a kind of debate that goes around a lot in queer spaces and in queer theory. So it's just something that I thought I'd raise because it's quite interesting. And another point that I wanted to sort of explain and bring to the table is something called the right to opacity. So opacity is a concept that the scholar Edouard Glissant came up with. And it's this idea that we can be opaque rather than fully transparent or fully invisible. Being opaque, having opacity, meaning that you can exist differently and essentially not to exist on the oppressor's terms. So not either through the cis heteronormative gaze or the male gaze, but the right to have representation, but on a queer person's terms. And that's what would be the right to opacity. This is, for me personally, what I see as the solution to these problems within representation. And I mentioned before about the different gazes. So of course, there's the heterosexual gaze. And ultimately, because the industry and society at large is still very much heterosexually dominant, they act as gatekeepers to representation. So that's what something is called the trapdoor theory. And that's why I put there trapdoor. So even when queer people are able to access the mainstream and get the top roles, it can be a trapdoor because they might get that, but then, other elements of the production aren't queer or aren't like safe spaces for them. And ultimately, even if they get one of the roles, the whole, the directing or the writing could have been through a heterosexual gaze, and therefore the way that the character is coded might also still be problematic. And I suppose a final thought on this slide would be whether even the production of an authentic queer representation is even possible in our society that's still so cis and heteronormative. Because of that, what does even authentic queer representation look like, and can it really exist in our current society and industry of cinema? So next slide, please. So I'm now just going to read out a quote, and it's by author and comic and writer David Baddiel, who I'm sure people know. It's from his very recent book called Jews Don't Count, which, on a side note, I would highly recommend this book. It's about anti-Semitism, and it's absolutely incredible and thought-provoking. But I'm going to read out this quote because it's about representation, and it really speaks to the issues that we're trying to discuss today. So the progressive idea that you should only cast minority actors to play those minorities has a twofold motivation. It is partly an employment issue, a pushback against a previous open to all tradition that meant there was less work for minority actors. But it is also, and I would say at its core, more so about respect. There is something disrespectful, the reaction to Halle Berry and Scarlett Johansson suggests, about casting a cis actress in a transgender part. Just as a particular racism can only really be defined by the victims of that racism, the deep truth of identity is only available to those who live that identity. Casting a non-minority actor to mimic that identity feels, to the progressive eye, like an impersonation. An impersonation carries with it an element of mockery. or at least it is reductive, lessening the complexity of that experience by channeling it through an actor who hasn't lived it. So I think that's a really, really poignant quote and speaks for itself in terms of these issues. Next slide, please. Thank you. So why is representation important? It increases visibility, and that can be really validating for minorities who are invisible in the media and society otherwise. It also encourages people to consider themselves outside of the cis heteronormative constructs and perhaps even recognize their queerness in the first place by seeing it represented. Also, non-queer people can view queer characters with good, authentic representation, i.e. that comes from lived experiences, it's nuance, and it gives the person agency. And that can be helpful in challenging prejudices, including unconscious biases. So the more that people see minorities represented on screen, essentially the less likely they are to other them or to have unconscious biases against them. So representation, therefore, does go hand in hand with the fight for equality and equity for LGBTQ plus people in society. However, it is met with a backlash too. And this is what I kind of mentioned before about Paris is Burning. So when a particularly vulnerable community will gain some representation and gain some rights and visibility, for example, over the past 5 to 10 years, we've seen a lot more trans and non-binary visibility in media discourses. However, that has been met with a backlash in transphobia, in society at large, and in discourses in like our mainstream press, for example, and in political discourses. So with that increased representation, increased visibility, comes the increased risk and the backlash. So it's kind of this balancing act, and really just underscores the need to also have protections and rights for people in legislation, and structural inequalities need to be tackled. So I've said as well here, demanding better representation in all aspects of the film industry. So not just the actors, but in all aspects, and showcasing those who are doing it well already, and challenging the negative and absences of diverse representation is really key in order to move forward with these issues of representation. So next slide, please. And there's a real big need for intersectionality. It's not something that we can overlook when we talk about representation. So obviously I'm discussing queer representation. However, we must admit that that is overwhelmingly white, cis, and able-bodied in terms of its mainstream present discourse. So people from identities where there are actually multiple systems of oppression at play, for example, a Black trans disabled woman, they can face additional barriers with finding authentic and positive representation of themselves on screen. And that reflects the additional barriers that they face in society. So therefore, we must remember to not be complacent with progress in queer representation in media, especially if it's still whitewashed and lacking in the huge diversity within the LGBTQ plus spectrum. So we can't just sort of think these couple of examples or however many examples of queer representation is enough if it's still overwhelmingly white and cis and able-bodied, for example. There is actually so many stories left to be told, so many, and we've barely even started. So next slide, please. I think this is the last one as well. Yes, about Supernova, coming back to the film that we're here to discuss today. So I've thought about Supernova, whether it's, and I've put good in quotation marks because I think that the binary terms of bad and good are quite reductive because it's actually quite a nuanced debate. So whether Supernova is good queer representation or not is ultimately down to someone's personal decision. But in terms of what I thought about it, obviously we have got straight actors, Colin Firth and Stanley Tucci, playing gay roles. And historically that can be very problematic. And at the moment, it is considered quite problematic, I would say, and both Colin and Stanley have spoken about this in relation to Supernova, and I think it's something that they've sort of said that they were concerned about and that they did consider before they took the roles, but the fact of the matter is they still took the roles regardless. But it must be said that Supernova has been pretty well received, even by the queer community in spite of this, especially when compared to the queer response to, let's say, Prom. And Prom was not very well received at all because James Corden's performance of a gay man was very much considered a bit of a parody, borderline offensive, because we know that he's not a gay man. It very much felt like a simulation of what he felt a gay man should be doing. And that's why it touched a nerve and didn't land very well. Whereas with Supernova, people seem to think that it's quite authentically performed, and then it's believable, and that it's sensitive. And therefore, this shows that it's not black and white, and you can't just have a blanket policy on it. It's more nuanced than that. And the other thing, the positive thing about Supernova, is that the plot is not centered around them being gay. It's a love story, and it's about the tragic impacts of dementia on a couple that so happen to be gay. And it's not about queer trauma, therefore, and it's not sensationalizing that in any way. It's not even really making an issue, as it were, of the fact that they are a gay couple, which is a good aspect of this representation, because it very much normalizes the queer experience, which is important to normalize the queer experience, because obviously we are people just like everyone else who can have partners who get dementia and can experience and have the capacity for tragedy and for joy that's not in such relation to our queerness. So I think that there needs to be a balance of both these big celebrations of queerness in representation, but also these more normalized celebrations of queerness in representation in cinema. And I suppose a final point is about the intention. People speak about whether it all comes down to the intention. What's the intention of the director, the writer, or the actor to perform and to take on the role, even if, for example, they're straight but the role is queer? But is that more important than the outcome, I suppose? And the outcome, regardless of whether the intention is good, I do believe that Colin and Stanley's intentions were very good with taking on these roles, and that they've done very well with them. But that being said, we can't deny that the outcome could be still some adverse effects for the queer community, and particularly for queer actors who may very well have wanted to have that role and have lived experience of what's being shown in Supernova, but didn't have the chance to, because two straight men were cast for the role instead. So those are just some things and some sort of food for thought on these whole issues of representation in relation to Supernova. Next slide, I think, is the last one. Yes, it was just some recommendations. So there's a couple of recommendations here. Variety of books and articles, and also some documentaries. So we've got Disclosure on Netflix, and that came out last year, and that is a really brilliant documentary about trans representation. It goes through history, through time, through how trans people have been represented in terms of the very problematic representations, but also paying attention to the nuances of what's been good and how those representations, even the bad ones, have brought trans people forward nonetheless. So it's a really great documentary, and that's on Netflix. Then there's a couple of scholars. Stuart Hall's done amazing work on representation. Judith Butler, a great feminist scholar and queer theory scholar, her book Gender Trouble was pretty groundbreaking. Edouard Glissant even, and Betsy Wing, the book that I mentioned before about the right to opacity, that comes from the book Poetics of Relation. And then I've just got a couple of articles here about trans representation that were quite interesting. That Eric Stanley one is available as a free PDF online, so you could actually find that online quite easily. But this list is not exhaustive. Representation is a huge topic. I've kind of just scratched the surface of it here today. So there's plenty more books and YouTube videos and essays that you could read on it to kind of come up with your own opinion on it as well. The next slide is the final slide, I promise. There is one more. It's just to point people in our direction if they need. So yeah, thank you for listening. I hope that was interesting, and maybe you learned something from it. If you do, or anyone that you know does need maybe some help from Lancashire LGBT, or any of the things that I mentioned about Lancashire LGBT seem interesting to you, or you want to speak to me more about any of that, please just get in touch. That's our website. And we do also have social media, Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook, which is just our name, Lancashire LGBT. So yeah, I'd be more than happy to hear from you. So yeah, thank you very much. That was my presentation. If there's any questions, happy to answer them now or at the end. I think we're going to do that.
Thank you. That was really I really enjoyed that.
Oh, good.
You can tell how much like genuine like passion and interest you have, and it's really nice to see. And I think, yeah, it's definitely only just scratching the surface, but made a lot of great points. So I'm really happy with that.
Oh, thanks.
I'm going to get the next one up whilst we're here. And then Emily, would you like to get ready?
Of course, tough act to follow. But yeah, just to reiterate, that was so incredibly informative. Sorry, put my notes up as alongside. So yeah, hey everyone. Just a reminder, my name is Emily Hamilton. I've just graduated from Edinburgh University studying geography and history. So now I'm a full-time theatre producer, having co-founded Definitely Fine in 2019. Here's just a couple of plays I've produced recently, Ezra and You'll See Everything. My company's kind of logo, and then on the right there is a very professional looking Zoom with myself and Stella Green and Freddie Cotton, the two other members of Definitely Fine. We all identify as queer, we're all bi women, and yeah, what I want to talk today kind of overlaps like a little bit, which I think is great, and follows on the importance of authentic queer representation on screen and on stage. So next slide, please. And I mean, as we can tell from the last presentation, this is a topic that's gone on for ages. Just a quick Google came up with all these results, just to name a few. And I think at one point there was much more a kind of binary question where should queer actors only get to play, no, is that the right way around? Yeah, should queer actors only play gay roles, queer roles? And I think, like Beth said, it's much more nuanced than that, and it's allowing for those kind of slightly more complex issues to be spoken about in a less binary way. I think when it comes to transgender roles, that's where it is an over resounding yes. But today I'm going to be speaking predominantly about sexuality. And I think maybe a slightly more helpful question is how successfully can a straight person engage with queer themes, and what does that mean for queer actors when straight actors are casting queer roles? So next slide, please. And as Beth highlighted, the reason that I wanted to talk to this about this today is because Supernova beautifully depicts a gay romance by Stanley Tucci and Colin Firth, but they are both straight, as is the director, Harry McQueen. It's worthy of note that these are maybe two of my favourite actors, male actors. If I can magically pick to have two gay dads, I presume they would be up there. Their performance in this is magnificent, and although, you know, what immediately just struck me is the fact they are straight. Next slide, please. And this isn't really surprising, given some queer films we've had recently. Here's just a few that came to mind: Brokeback Mountain, Call Me By Your Name, Disobedience, God's Own Country, The Favourite, Bohemian Rhapsody, Portrait of a Lady on Fire, Rocketman, Ammonite, Philadelphia, and Milk. Just to literally name a few that came to my head that are films that that portray queer themes through vehicles that are straight, all that had varying degrees of authenticity, and all had varying responses from audiences. Next slide, please. Milk is one that came to mind, and for example, that is a film that depicts an important moment in queer history. It's a biopic of Harvey Milk, and he was a politician and a gay activist. He was the first openly gay person to be elected into public office in California in 1978. Sean Penn plays Milk, and James Franco plays his partner, both of which are straight. And Penn was nominated for numerous awards, including a BAFTA and a Golden Globe. and won an Academy Award and an Oscar for his performance. Hence the awards. You know, his performance was deemed very exceptional. And I think that kind of brings up the initial argument that isn't this the whole point? That's the whole point of acting? It's a craft and an art whereby you're able to transform yourself into someone new. You can learn the traits and the behaviors and portray it convincingly on stage. And next slide, please. And this quote from Rachel Wise really speaks to that kind of argument. She was speaking to Gay Star News ahead of the release of Disobedience, which came out, I think, a few years ago now, and it explores a lesbian romance in London's Orthodox Jewish community. She said, "I wanted to tell this story and represent it. I see my task not to tell the story that I have lived. When I play Blanche Du Bois on stage, I'm not an alcoholic. I'm not interested in sleeping with teenage boys, but that's the character. So I see storytelling as becoming people that I'm not. I'm not anyone that I play, otherwise it would just be a documentary." As a queer producer, I hate this quote, and I think it does complete disservice to the nuances of casting straight actors in queer roles. I think ultimately, maybe in the long-term future, that is the ultimate goal, is that anyone, regardless of the sexuality, can be thought to play of any role. But unfortunately, that's not the reality of the current situation, as I'm sure you're all aware. Next slide, please. So on the left here, we have Billy Eichner, and I found this quote, which I thought was grand, and it says, "After we applaud gay actors for coming out, we thank them, we put them on the front of magazines, and then we take them off casting lists." And then Pose star Billy Porter on the right reinforced this, that there are double standards for queer actors who have to watch while straight actors beat them to queer roles, and casting directors often are unable to perceive queer actors capable of playing straight parts. He said, "If flamboyantly isn't in the description of the character, no one would ever see me for anything, which wouldn't have been so enraging if it went the other direction, but it doesn't. Straight men playing gay, and everyone wants to give them an award." No openly gay man has ever won Best Actor in the Oscars. I think that's correct, but you know, when you say a statement with such invigoration, and now you're like, is that right? But I've done my research, I promise. And so I think that just shows these two insights are so incredibly useful in thinking about the question, you know, what does it mean for queer people who straight people play roles for? And ultimately, I think it comes down to what Beth was saying, employment, opportunity. It means there are less opportunities for queer people. In a world where queer people are rarely ever thought to play anything outside of queer roles, and queer roles are so limited, and if a straight actor who has all these options takes a queer role, you're literally taking work away from a queer actor. And I think that's especially important to think about given the last couple of years we've had, where those who are marginalised within our communities are going to be the most quick to fall through the gaps, given the pandemic. And it also perpetuates a cycle where actors remain closeted for fear of missing out or being taken off casting lists. Next slide, please. And it also can be thought about through lived experience, like Beth said. Queer people are able to offer such great knowledge to a production. By having them in the room, they're able to relate to the character better. They might be able to access the emotions of the story, of the queer themes better. So it's an immense creative benefit, and it also prevents stereotypes and caricatures being played, much like James Corden here. So my brother, for example, who's a straight man, will never really know what it's like for me to walk down the street holding hands with my girlfriend. And that is where intersectionality is so important, because that's true of me, but I also live in an incredibly white area, and I will never truly understand what it's like for a Black person walking down the street. So it's just about allowing for those nuances, and allowing people the space to authentically play the parts that they are wanting to portray. Next slide, please. Further nuances get put into it when you're dealing with big budgets. So for Supernova, when Harry McQueen, the director of it's been challenged, he said that Stanley Tucci and Colin Firth attracted the PR and the budget to be able to take this film to places it otherwise would never have been taken to. And that comes back to, is like Beth was saying, no representation better than bad representation. But I think at the end of the day, it kind of perpetuates a cycle. If we're only going to give queer roles to straight people because they're famous, queer people are not going to come out and are not going to see themselves or think that that's something they can do. And so we have such a limited number of queer famous actors that would attract these big budgets needed. Further nuances is something that I particularly have to think about through producing, is the production, you know, who's behind the camera. And this comes down to how successfully can a straight person connect to the queer themes, and you know, who's funding it, who's directing it, who's stage management, who's the costume and the makeup. All those aspects help to fulfill an authentic portrayal of a queer role, and also how an actor is treated. You know, there is no point casting a queer actor in a queer role if they don't feel like they've got allies in set, if they've not got people around to protect them, to empower them, if they feel like there's injustices within the environment. If they're not able to speak up, we might as well cast a straight actor. And I think that this is something that Cassie Leon, a theatre producer who is kind of known for cabaret shows and drag shows of Black queer people, she has to think of a risk assessment for how she's going to get her performance from home to the venue. At the venue, the runners, the bar staff, everyone, is there going to be dangers of misgendering, of dead names being used, of a kind of casual homophobia or racism? These are all things that we need to think about. Next slide, please. And ultimately, as Beth said, it just comes down to respect. At the end of the day, it's thinking about how we can all be the best allies possible. And a huge part of that is listening to the communities, to the issue concerned, especially when something is as muddy and complex and nuanced as this. If a community or a member of the community is speaking up against a casting choice that doesn't feel fair, or the performance of queerness feels offensive or disrespectful or not authentic, it's about listening and learning, and ultimately just passing that mic to empower others to speak up and believe them when they do. And this is not, I don't think, about council culture. You know, everyone should be allowed the space and the time to grow. I'm a bi woman sat here presenting this, and it wasn't too long ago that I would use homophobic slurs on the playground. You know, I allowed myself that time. I'm grateful that I had a time to learn from my mistakes and to do better. But it is particularly frustrating when, and very harmful at times, when we see people who have the resources, the time, the money, and the infrastructures around them to educate themselves and listen to communities, and then don't. And these mistakes can perpetuate or antagonize pre-existing power relations and violence, especially when it comes to transgender roles. Eddie Redmayne could leave the set of The Danish Girl, leave the transness of his role behind, and go on to transport and to live and everything as, you know, his in his cishet body. But that's not the option for other people. So yeah, ultimately, I think it just really does come down to respect. And next slide is, thank you very much for having me. I think that this was just a very brief insight. I really don't have all the answers. I don't have most of them. And I do think it's a subjective argument. And this is just my humble opinion. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much for speaking with us. I'm trying to get the screen share to stop. There we go. Thank you. Again, I think that was an amazing presentation. It's really good to hear sort of the behind the scenes of from like the producing aspect. I think that's something a lot of people forget, especially when talking about sort of in the industry. You think of like who's in front of the camera, but we always forget sort of behind the camera matters as well. I've never sort of thought of it in the sense of, you know, if you have these queer actors, you know, they have to deal with sort of maybe like homophobic slurs when they're walking around. Like I've never considered that to be something I've thought about, and so that's something now I'm gonna go away and think about. So it's really nice to have that sort of idea. And I think, I work at the Duke's Theatre, I will have to go away and ask them, you know, what things that they have in place to sort of avoid these kind of issues, because it is a conversation people should be having, I think, in all workspaces, really, to make sure everyone feels like they can be their authentic self and not feel like they might have to hide parts to avoid these sort of awkward conversations, I think. So thank you very much for that. If anybody has any questions for our guests, feel free to pop them in the chat box and we will read them out and we'll answer them. So we've got one right away. So what's a LGBTQ plus trope you're sick of seeing in the media, and what's an LGBTQ plus story you'd love to see in the future? Do either of you automatically have an answer, or am I gonna have to pick someone?
So two really good questions. Thanks, Katrina. I mean, there's quite a few. I think the first one that comes to mind about the trope that I think is can be quite damaging and sick of seeing in the media. It kind of is for all sort of queer people, is that their lives are like so entrenched in pain, and that they can seemingly only have the capacity for depression and very severe mental health issues and tragedy, like particularly in relation to trans people and the trans experience. And that's what I mean about like the tragic queer ending. That does really frustrate me, because it's such a form of othering, and it's just so basic. Like, I think that this idea that queer people, LGBTQ plus people, trans people, like their entire existence is defined by their pain through their identity, I think that's just such a damaging idea. Of course, pain is an aspect of it, but it's not. Most of the time, queer people are just out here day to day like everyone else, just living their lives and experiencing the same things as other people, just maybe in slightly different ways. And also, just in addition to that, the queer community actually has the capacity for so much joy and fun and celebration. And I think that I'd like to see more of that rather than this constant like story of pain. And what was the other question? So you'd love to see in the future. Maybe just on a personal level, as a bi person, I think that I'd like to see more bisexual representation. I think there's actually quite a lot of bi erasure that happens within the LGBTQ plus community as well. So I personally would like to see some more bi stories told of bi men actually as well. I think that's something that doesn't get shown a lot. But yeah, what do you think, Emily?
No, I completely second that. The only other thing I would throw in there is that as a bi woman in a queer relationship, I would love to see more work about babies and about different options for babies. Why do I not know these when this is me? I think there are some depictions of gay dads, Modern Family is maybe something that comes to mind. But I think there is much less about maybe the options that are open and the difficulties of that within the UK and the NHS and things like that. I would really love to see some films and plays around that.
Oh, I love the idea of that. So we have another question from Flo, which is, what do you guys think about the seeming fetishization of gay male relationships by straight women? I'm thinking some of the public response to films like Call Me By Your Name. Great presentations, by the way.
That's
very interesting, Flo.
I do think that's really interesting, because often it's fetishization of queer women, I think, often through the male gaze. And I think that how there's ways around that, it's about normalizing these relationships. And also, I think it's about a lot, I think often with film, it's to do with the camera lens. And that's what I think comes back to like behind the camera, who is there, and like Beth said, what's the intention? Yeah, I think that's a difficult one. It's not something I've thought about too much, to be honest.
Yeah, I feel sort of called in a good way. So thank you for that, Flo. I think that referencing Call Me By Your Name did sort of irk me a little bit, because I'm thinking that I was probably complicit in some type of fetishization of the two of the gay male couple in that. I actually saw a TikTok the other day from a gay man who was speaking about how a lot of straight women in the past have said to him homophobic things, essentially like, oh, it's such a shame that you're gay. So like I think that kind of feeds into this issue that we maybe don't think about as much, and that maybe that, you know, straight women need to maybe attend to a bit more. I don't really know what else to say on that, other than it's a really good point to raise and we should think about it more. I think that we should therefore look at all different angles of representation, and particularly fetishization, because it is damaging. And like I said, in that TikTok, the person who was speaking, he was saying that that's something that offended him and upset him when he heard those comments. So it's an important lived experience to think about.
Yeah, definitely. I think like Gay Best Friend kind of falls into that one as well.
Yeah.
So it's like, if we're only showing these stories or these characters for the benefit or the enjoyment of straight people, then, you know, we're kind of back at square one. If those characters only exist to fulfill the characters that are straight around them, then yeah, back to square one. And I think that you're so right. It's stuff to think about.
Thank you. And I think we might call this our last question. So another one from Katrina, which says, which character in a TV show or film did you first feel represented by? Or which character do you feel most represented by?
Oh God, why is that so hard?
It's hard.
I can't even think of the name of it, but there was a truly amazing BBC 3 series. It's like about bisexual people.
Oh, I was thinking of the BBC drama called Trigonometry, about a polyamorous throuple. But yeah, sorry, it's probably a different one.
That sounds great.
About.
I was gonna say that sounds quite interesting.
It's called Trigonometry. It's very good.
Oh
no, Grant, I'll try and find the name of it, and I'll send it on to you guys, because it's really grand, really, really good. I think I rewatched it like 3 times.
Yeah, it's hard, like I was saying, with bi representation, because I feel like I can't even really off the top of my head think of like a character that aligns completely with me. I have felt very like seen and really enjoyed seeing like lesbian representation on screen. Like the L Word is wonderful. When I watched Carol for the first time, I was just like, oh my god, this film's amazing. You know, so I think that just sort of films like that and characters like that there's also like queer coded characters, I suppose. Like even growing up, I think people think back to like different cartoons and stuff, and there was like those queer coded characters, and you think, oh, that's why I kind of identified with that character, because they were kind of queer coded in some way rather than being explicitly queer. But yeah, like I was saying before, I do think that there's a need to have more bi representation. But that Trigonometry not documentary series very much portrayed polyamory in an authentic way, rather than in like a sensationalist or actually just problematic way. So that's a good example of like a polyamorous representation.
Awesome, thank you. Wow, I think we will tie things up now. It has been wonderful to talk to you. Thank you so much again for coming with these amazing presentations, just bringing your knowledge and your energy. It's been really great. I think you've given us all a lot of stuff to think about, really. and maybe even yourselves have got things to think about now. And I think it's just good to keep this dialogue going, keeping the conversation going with different people. So thank you. I feel pumped. I really enjoyed that.
Thanks so much for having us.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed it. And sorry, I forgot about Feel Good, which is on Netflix at the moment. That's amazing. That's really good representation. I love that. And I love Mae Martin.
Awesome.
But yeah, thank you so much. It was a great session. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm losing my daylight a bit, like it's getting bright in my face. So sorry if you can't see me, but for everyone's reference, if you are in Lancaster and you'd like to see Supernova and judge it for yourself, all of the show times will be on our website. I will send that out to everybody. I do have this little form that if everyone could fill out for me would be incredibly useful. We use that to send to our charity funders that help us put on sessions like these. So it just tells us who's around. Other than that, thank you very much. I hope everyone has a lovely rest of your evenings. Go away and enjoy some queer cinema, you know, watch the football, either or. Have a lovely evening, everybody. Good night.
Thank you. Bye. Bye, everyone.
Bye.